Representative Aiken is tied up in the Budget Committee hearing process, and so I want to enter his remarks into the record, and let me quickly go over them. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This hearing will come to order. Thank you for joining us today as we consider the fiscal year 2012 budget request for the Department of the Navy Shipbuilding Acquisition Program. We have two panels of witnesses testifying today. The first panel are national defense experts specializing in naval issues from the Congressional Research Service and the Congressional Budget Office. They are Mr. Ron O'Rourke and David Eric Labs, respectively. Our second panel will be officials from the Navy and Marine Corps, which I will welcome later. Reviewing the Navy shipbuilding budget request for both this year and what's projected in the out years, there are many things to be concerned about. And probably the most worrisome aspect of the Navy's budget is that it will require near-perfect execution and cost control, schedule adherence, and risk mitigation efforts to obtain the force structure necessary to deter hostile threats, show force when needed, and, as a last resort, employ lethal operations. Among the concerns I have revolve around issues as such: the new Ford-class carrier program, EMALS integration, and forthcoming cost growth to the overall program, Ohio-class submarine replacement regarding its aggressive schedule and optimistic cost estimates so early in its program's development, our attack submarine inventory being 9 submarines short of the requirement in the out years, a shipbuilding budget estimated by CBO that may not permit the Navy to achieve the 313 ship floor, and a shipbuilding industrial base in which 50% of major U.S. shipyards' future viability and ability to perform as needed to meet the Navy's acquisition plan remains in question. My last concern focuses on congressional and Department of Defense collaboration, or should I say, the apparent lack thereof. Too many times in the recent past, we have been excluded from Department of Defense deliberations or approached with hasty requests that do not afford us the luxury of effectively evaluating decisions. Most recently, LCS and EFE. Bottom line, this must change. Lastly, we are part of this problem too. The Congress must finish fiscal year 11 defense appropriations legislation because the implications of funding the Navy and Marine Corps at fiscal year 2010 funding levels in a year-long continuing resolution would be almost irreparable. All of our men and women in uniform deserve more from this body. It goes without saying. We have the finest, most professional, combat-honed sailors, Marines, airmen, and soldiers that any modern military has ever had within its ranks, and our responsibility as a subcommittee is to ensure that we provide them the equipment and tools necessary in meeting our nation's national security requirements. In conclusion, I would like to note that although our subcommittee has had a number of closed events already, this is our first public hearing of the year. It is an honor to chair this subcommittee and to follow in the footsteps of a number of previous chairmen who did much to make sure that our nation maintains strong sea services. With that, I turn to my good friend and partner, the ranking member from North Carolina, Mike McIntyre, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, and also thanks to our chairman in his absence. And thank you all for the opportunity to let us question you today. Thank you to Mr. O'Rourke from Congressional Research Service and Dr. Labs from the CBO for being here. We all look forward to your expert opinions about where the Navy is heading with regard to shipbuilding and acquisition strategy. I also welcome our Navy and Marine Corps friends who will be appearing as part of the second panel. As we begin to analyze the detail of the Navy's FY 2011 shipbuilding and acquisition plans, it's important that we look not only what it proposes for this coming year, but also what it presents for the following out years. Many of the proposed efficiencies that were recently announced depend heavily on our future acquisition strategy, whether that be multi-year procurement on ships or the development of a new amphibious vehicle. I'm hopeful the Navy will be able to adhere to their proposals so that savings of those difficult choices may be realized. Like our chairman, these are areas that I remain concerned about. The stated goal of the Navy is a sustained fleet of 313 ships. There has been some debate on how much it will cost per year to achieve this goal and to maintain it. So I'm particularly concerned about whether the current plan is sustainable, especially as new programs such as the SSB and X, begin to come online and demand a larger portion of the shipbuilding budget. The fact that our submarine force, both attack and guided missile submarines, continues to decline is a concern because their demand, as we know, is constantly increasing. I look forward to hearing what both panels have to say in regard to our future gaps in submarine requirements. We know our shipbuilding industrial base remains very fragile. We've seen how even minor changes in shipbuilding plans can have major impacts on the industrial base. It is critical that the shipbuilding workforce move to a more stable situation in order to provide what our great Navy needs. We are very aware of the stresses that the current continuing resolution has put on the Navy, and we've heard that in testimony before the larger full committee as well. I'm hopeful that we will be able to achieve in the 2011 fiscal year appropriations bill that we'll be able to do what we need to do, but in the meantime, appreciate any recommendations that you may have that would mitigate the risk in the interim. Thank you for your service. We look forward to hearing your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now we'll hear from our witnesses in the first panel. Mr. Ronald O'Rourke, Specialist in National Defense Congressional Research Service. Mr. O'Rourke.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McIntyre, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss Navy shipbuilding programs. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to submit my written statement for the record and make a couple of brief points. First, it should be noted that the Navy has revised some of its ship force structure goals over the last 5 years, and these goals no longer add up to a fleet of 313 ships. In this sense, the 313 figure is no longer a fully accurate summation of Navy ship goals. The Navy expects to soon complete a new force structure assessment which could support an official replacement for the 313 ship plan. A replacement plan would support effective congressional oversight of Navy shipbuilding by giving members an official and fully accurate set of force level goals against which to assess proposed Navy programs. My testimony outlines a number of potential shipbuilding execution challenges, including those that would arise under the scenario of a year-long CR, the possibility of cost growth on ship designs that are planned to start procurement in future years, the question of the disposition of Northrop's shipyards, and execution challenges that are specific to individual shipbuilding programs. But right now, the one point I'd like to focus on are the shortfalls in attack submarines and in cruisers and destroyers that are projected to occur in the 2020s and beyond, even if the Navy's 30-year shipbuilding plan is fully implemented. These projected shortfalls are significant. If they occur, they could make it difficult or impossible for the Navy to fully perform its projected missions. The additional destroyer that the Navy has added in FY14 will mitigate the cruiser-destroyer shortfall at the margin, but it would take a lot more than one extra destroyer to substantially redress this shortfall. Similarly, the Navy hopes to restore the second Virginia-class boat in FY18, but it would take more than one additional boat to substantially mitigate the attack boat shortfall. These projected shortfalls have been on the books since last year, but they haven't received much attention in public discussions of the Navy's shipbuilding plan. This might be because they look like they're far in the future, but in terms of issues they might pose for policymakers, that's not necessarily the case. Substantially redressing these shortfalls could involve putting additional destroyers and attack boats into the shipbuilding plan, or extending the service lives of existing cruisers, destroyers, and attack boats. These options, which could be combined, pose near-term policy issues for policymakers. Based on past information from the Navy, substantially mitigating the attack boat shortfall for wartime as well as peacetime operations would require adding 4 boats to the plan. And that assumes that pressures on the shipbuilding budget caused by the Ohio replacement program don't cause any currently planned Virginia-class boats to drop out of the shipbuilding plan, which is a real possibility. Substantially mitigating the even bigger cruiser-destroyer shortfall might require adding at least 10 and possibly closer to 20 additional destroyers to the plan. And that assumes no increase to the current force level goal for cruisers and destroyers to reflect the Navy's newly expanded missile defense responsibilities. Because of the pressures that the Ohio replacement program could place on the shipbuilding budget, one option would be to add at least some, if not most or all of these additional destroyers and attack boats to the shipbuilding plan in the years prior to the Ohio replacement boats. If so, then the question of whether to add these ships to the plan could become a near-term issue for policymakers. The alternative of extending the lives of existing cruisers, destroyers, and attack boats by 10 or 15 years beyond their currently planned lives poses serious questions of feasibility and cost-effectiveness, especially for the attack boats. If this option were feasible, implementing it could require increasing, perhaps starting right away, funding levels for the maintenance of these ships to help ensure they'll remain in good enough shape to eventually have their lives extended for another 10 or 15 years. This additional maintenance funding would be on top of the funding that the Navy has already programmed to help get these ships out to the end of their currently planned lives. And because this additional funding might need to start soon, it could again pose a near-term issue for policymakers. Implementing either of these options within the Navy's currently planned top line would likely compel the Navy to reduce other critical programs below desired levels. So the question of what to do about these two projected shortfalls is not only a potentially near-term issue for policymakers, but one that could also raise fundamental questions for policymakers about the value of naval forces in defending the nation's interests and the priority that naval forces should receive in the allocation of overall DoD funds. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my testimony. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I'll be pleased to respond to any questions you might have.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. O'Rourke. Mr. Eric Labs, Senior Analyst for Naval Forces and Weapons, Congressional Budget Office. Mr. Labs.
Mr. Chairman, Representative McIntyre, members of the subcommittee, it is a pleasure to be here today to discuss the Navy's 2012 shipbuilding plan. My written testimony, which I submit for the record, focuses on the costs and force structure implications of the Navy's fiscal year 2011 30-year shipbuilding plan. CBO cannot yet provide a detailed analysis of the Navy's fiscal year 2012 10-year shipbuilding plan, as it was just released early last week. However, because the observed changes between the two plans are minor, I can still speak to the long-term affordability of the Navy shipbuilding program and some specifics about the 2012 plan. If the Navy receives the same amount of funding for ship construction in the next 30 years that it has over the last 30 years, which is about $15 billion a year for all activities related to ship construction, which means new builds, carrier refuelings, and outfitting and post-delivery, it will not be able to afford all of the 276 ships that are advertised in the 2011 shipbuilding plan. CBO's analysis of the 2011 plan showed that the Navy would need $19 billion a year in new ship construction alone and $21 billion a year for all necessary activities in the Navy shipbuilding accounts. Under its 2012 plan, the Navy plans to buy 106 ships over the next 10 years, compared to 104 ships under the same period under the 2011 plan. The breakdown between combat ships and support ships is essentially the same in the two plans. Both would buy 30 support ships between 2012 and 2021, although the composition of those ships varies slightly. The 2012 plan would buy 76 combat ships versus 74 under the 2011 plan. Over the next 5 years, the Navy plans to spend 9% more in real terms on new ship construction compared to the last 5 years. The Navy's estimates over the next 5 years, however, do place them in line with the longer historical average of about $15 billion a year in 2011 constant dollars. CBO's preliminary analysis of the Navy's 2012 10-year shipbuilding plan does not substantially change the assessment that the Navy continues to have a long-term funding challenge, particularly in the 2020s, when the new class of ballistic missile submarines are built. Still, there are several reasons to believe that while the overall costs of the Navy shipbuilding plan are likely to be somewhat lower over the 30-year period, they will still be substantially higher than the historical average. The reasons why the cost might be somewhat lower include the following. SSB&X cost reduction efforts. The Navy has announced that through various refinements to the preliminary design of the SSB&X, it has reduced estimated costs of those ships by an average of about $1 billion per boat. CBO has not yet conducted its own analysis of those changes and their potential impact on costs, but it is reasonable to conclude that CBO's estimate for those ships could go down as well. Second, the LCS competition and subsequent dual award contracts. The reduction in the average price of the LCS from about $550 million in CBO's estimate of the Navy's 2011 plan per ship to $450 million per ship under the Navy's dual award strategy for the ships purchased from 2010 to 2016, if carried forward beyond 2016, would reduce the overall cost of the Navy's shipbuilding plan slightly over the next 30 years. And third, projections of long-term ship inflation declined, making ships in the far term less expensive than they had been projected last year. As CBO reports have detailed for several years, shipbuilding inflation has been substantially higher than price inflation as the economy as a whole for quite some time. However, projections of long-term Navy shipbuilding inflation declined between the 2011 plan and the 2012 plan, such that, if all other things remained equal, average annual shipbuilding costs would be less by about $1 billion over the long term. Nevertheless, even accounting for that change, that would still place the Navy's funding requirements well above the historical average. Overall, one can expect the Navy's total requirements for shipbuilding, new construction, carrier refueling, and outfitting costs are still likely to be in the range of $19 to $20 billion a year. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I would like to make a quick observation about the overall number of ships in the Navy's fleet. Echoing what Mr. O'Rourke said, under the 2012 plan, the Navy's implied ship requirement of about 322 ships would be met by 2020, but then fall back below that force level by the late 2020s. Significant shortfalls in the late 2020s and beyond in the number of surface combatants, attack submarines, and amphibious ships would remain under the Navy's 2012 shipbuilding plan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would be happy to respond to any questions the subcommittee may have.
Thank you. Let me begin. First of all, I think, Mr. O'Rourke, you mentioned the service life extension program for some of these. I think you were referring to cruisers and destroyers, shortfall in cruisers and destroyers, and you said that would have to go on top of what is currently planned to be expended. Can you give an idea? I mean, just any kind of rough estimate on the cost of the burden of doing a SLEP program?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Mr. Chairman, you're correct. I was referring to the fact that you'd have to put additional maintenance funding on top of what the Navy has already put into their budget to help ensure that those ships at least make it out to the end of their currently planned lives. How much more they would have to add, I don't know, and it would depend in part on the condition of the ships themselves over time, and also exactly how many extra years they wanted to add to the lives of those ships. What the Navy would need to do is come up with a new integrated maintenance strategy that was designed in anticipation of keeping a ship in service, a destroyer or an older cruiser, for 40 or 45 years, as opposed to some shorter figure. And I don't know what the delta would be in terms of the maintenance funding, but it would very possibly require the addition of that funding on top of what the Navy has in its budget already.
Mr. Labs, do you have any comment on the using the service life extension program in lieu of or extending out the time in which we'd have to build new ships? Replacement.
Well, I would agree with Mr. O'Rourke on that. We don't know exactly how much that would cost, and that would indeed vary from ship to ship. Certain ships will be in better material condition than other ships, and the level of investment that would be required is going to vary. And not only just on the maintenance side, but whether more updates to the combat systems would be necessary to make sure that not only that the ships can serve out 40 or 45 years, but they're going to be effective in a wartime environment out 40 or 45 years. In terms of being able to meet the Navy's shipbuilding goals, then it would certainly maintaining existing ships in service longer would be less expensive than buying new ships to replace them. But then it then becomes a question of what is the relative effectiveness that you're buying for the amount of money that you're spending, and that's something that the Navy would have to assess.
And it's also a less permanent solution. It's essentially a way of kicking the can down the road another 10 or 15 years. But those ships, if they had their lives extended, would still eventually retire, and the problem with the cruiser destroyer shortfall could recur at that point.
Just a question about the LCS and how the fact that we had sort of a two-tracked policy, that we had competition between two variants of the LCS. But in doing so, aren't we having two separate training programs to do that? And and from a career standpoint, in terms of training and the fact that you can't necessarily cross-deck those personnel, although maybe with additional training you can. To what extent is that a problem, and is that configured in terms of the cost savings?
Yeah, the Navy acknowledged in their testimony last year in support of the dual award plan that sticking with the production of both designs would create this situation. The Navy argued that they have had classes in the past of 12 ships, and that at a minimum they would have at least 12 ships of each design. They tended to argue that the costs that would be added onto the Navy's budget for maintaining two logistic systems and so on would be there, but that when calculated in net present value terms, that the figure would come to about $295 million additional dollars over the life cycle of the ships.
Okay. Any comment on that?
No, I would have echoed the same statements from the same facts from the Navy's testimony of last year. In terms of, let me just sort of address the issue of cross-decking sort of the personnel, if you will. Yes, it makes that slightly more complicated to cross-deck personnel from one type of LCS versus the other. But in my judgment, it wouldn't be that much different than a Flight 1 destroyer versus a Flight 2A destroyer on an Arleigh Burke class, or even when we used to have Spruances in the fleet, a Spruance versus an Arleigh Burke. It would be the challenges. There are challenges there, but there are challenges the Navy is well familiar with.
Very well. Mr. McIntyre?
Thank you. Just some clarification. Mr. O'Rourke, you mentioned the idea of adding destroyers and attack submarines to the shipbuilding program to reduce the projected shortfalls in these two categories of ships. How would those additional ships be funded given the constraints on future defense spending that we're likely to be looking at?
And that's the broader issue that I mentioned that I think would need to be confronted if you were to embark upon that kind of plan. I think the reason why those ships don't show in the 30-year plan right now is exactly because the Navy is trying to show that they are balancing their requirements while fitting under a top line. And so if you were to undertake a project like this, it would, I think, very likely lead to a broader debate about the value of naval forces in defending the nation's interests and what share of the DoD budget should go to the Navy. That is an argument that some observers have begun to articulate in recent weeks and months, and it's something that might be expanded on and pursued further as a part or of one way of getting at this situation of what to do about these shortfalls. But my focus has been to at least highlight the existence of these shortfalls, which have gone relatively unmentioned, even though they were present in the 30-year plan that was submitted last year, and to highlight the fact that even though they look like they're several years in the future, the options for addressing them include things that may require us to begin making decisions in the nearer term.
Okay. Dr. Labs, in your written testimony, you state that CBO's estimate for required funding to reach the 313 ship minimum, the Navy will require approximately $3 billion more than what the Navy currently plans for. What is the basis of your estimate? And in your opinion, if the Navy remains at its currently planned levels of funding, how many ships do you believe the Navy will be short of its 313 ship planned procurement?
Mr. McIntyre, what CBO goes about estimating the cost of the Navy shipbuilding plan through a variety of factors. We start off with sort of historical cost-to-weight relationships to estimate each individual ship in the program, and then we adjust that for the effects of learning. As you build more ships, you learn how to build them more efficiently and less expensively, hopefully. Also, we adjust those estimates by rate, how many ships are being built of the same type in the same yard at the same time. The more you build, you can spread overhead costs, and that would come down. And then we also apply the effects of this as a growth factor on the higher long-run shipbuilding inflation over the economy as a whole. I mean, that to my mind, that represents a real sort of cost to the taxpayer that needs to be accounted for in the way you project the long-term cost of a shipbuilding plan. And you're right, our estimate as of right now is $3 billion more than what sort of the Navy is estimating. So what force results from that if the Navy is stuck with a historical average of $15 billion, in other words, they must cut substantial numbers of ships out of their program, would depend very much on the composition of those cuts. If they choose to cut very expensive ships, you could end up having a force not of 313 or 322, but maybe somewhere around the force we have today of 280. If you cut more of a mix of less expensive ships, it could range anywhere from 200 to 250 ships in the fleet. It would depend very much on whoever would be the deciding authority, would be the Congress or the Navy, what they decide to remove from the shipbuilding plan in order to bring that overall budgetary level over the next 30 years into sort of a historical average line.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Rigel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. O'Rourke and also Dr. Labs for being here today and for your contribution to keeping our Navy strong. Let's see. The first question, Dr. Labs, I'd like to direct to you. And are there any maintenance or docking space requirements that are unique to the aluminum hull LCS? And if so, what are the cost and basing decisions, impacts rather, to the Navy?
The aluminum hull ship is certainly one that is, there are fewer maintenance yards, as I understand it from briefings from the Navy. There are fewer yards on either coast of the United States or even around the world that are capable of performing maintenance on those types of ships. So it's not that there aren't yards available, but there's going to be a lot less of them. So there's going to be more challenges involved on the part of the Navy that if a sudden breakdown occurs, to have a system in place where the ship receives the necessary maintenance that it would otherwise need to have. I don't have an assessment of what the costs that would be associated with that.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. O'Rourke, in your opening statement, you mentioned that service life extension option, and it's intriguing. Being able to extend the life of a ship by 10 to 15 years, and I know this is an option that's been carefully examined and considered by the Navy, and though it's very costly, it doesn't seem that the essential design of for hulls has changed that radically. It's not like an airframe, for example. So, what price do we pay in terms of performance or lethality of the ship being able to project power by a more of a comprehensive overhaul and extending the life by 10 to 15 years, rather than going with an all-new ship?
One of the things that you pay for, or one of the downsides of this option, is that you're working with a ship that has probably less growth margin remaining in it than a brand new ship would, and consequently it's not just a matter of examining the material condition of the ship and making the ship mechanically able to operate. It's also a matter, as Dr. Labs mentioned, of maintaining the mission effectiveness of the ship and whether the ship has enough space and weight and power and cooling and so on to support the kind of modern combat systems that would keep it mission effective in that future threat environment.
Okay. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Labs, you mentioned that you haven't done an analysis yet of the revised Ohio estimates that the Navy just released. And when do you think that will be completed?
Well, I plan to request that information, sort of get a detailed briefing from the Navy, and I'm hoping that will occur over sometime. That briefing would get scheduled sometime over the next month. Typically, those briefings occur with both Mr. O'Rourke and myself. And then, as a follow-on to that, I will be doing an analysis of the Navy's then 2012 at least 10-year shipbuilding plan, and it would be incorporated into that analysis sometime over the next few months.
And I'm just trying to remember what your estimates were before this revision. I mean, as I recall, you were still higher than
That's right.
the Navy in that instance as well.
Allow me to recap for a moment. In the 2011 plan, the Navy had an average price of their 12 boomers as $7.2 billion, which actually broke out to about $9 billion for the lead ship and $6.7 or so for the follow-on ships. So today what the Navy is saying is they've actually, and CBO's numbers in comparison were about $13 billion for the lead ship and 7.8 or so billion for the follow-on ships, with an average of sort of 8.2 over the entire class, 7.2 versus 8.2 for the entire class. Now, the Navy's estimate as of this year, what they've been advertising so far, they said that the follow-on ships are now 5.6 billion. At least they think they've gotten it down to that point. Although their lead ship did come up. Their lead ship is now $11.6 billion because they have increased the amount that is going to be allocated to sort of non-recurring detailed design and engineering. So they've sort of actually come closer to the CBO estimate on the lead ship, and we've sort of parted company, at least for now, on the follow-on ships.
And I mean, that is a pretty wide gap between what you have always consistently projected, which, to your credit, has always been consistent. I mean, can you sort of explain, where you guys are just so divergent?
Well, in terms of the comparison between the numbers of under the 2011 plan, when they had a sort of class-wide average of 7.2 and we had a class-wide average of 8.2, our methods were actually fairly similar, and really the difference between us was sort of how we treated that long-run shipbuilding inflation. The Navy did not sort of account for, how should I put it, they did not sort of attach an additional cost on their ships in constant dollar terms to account for that long-run inflation the way I did. If I would factor that inflation issue out of my methodology, our numbers would have been exactly the same, or very close to being exactly the same. Now that the Navy has sort of gone through and what they have said is they've refined their preliminary design, they've done a number of things to it, like going from a 20-tube submarine to a 16-tube submarine, reducing the diameter of the tubes, and several other things. They have stated that they have managed to reduce the costs of at least the follow-on ships somewhere in the neighborhood of about $1 billion a boat. What I don't know yet, and it could be that once I sort of see how they've done that and understand those details far better, it could be that the CBO estimate could come down in a similar fashion, or not. I just don't know enough of the details to know whether that will be the case.
Right. Ron, your report again talks, and the chart shows what you're projecting out. I mean, if this CR somehow ends up with a disaster scenario where we don't implement the upgrade in terms of the Virginia class, and also, well, we'll set the Ohio aside. But I mean, if we don't get that through this year, I mean, that really just kind of will that create a domino effect in terms of what those numbers are going to look like even before the shortfall that you were describing?
I think it would add an extra challenge to that situation, because the scenario of a year-long CR would create complications for both the Virginia-class program and the Ohio-class program, Ohio replacement program. In the Virginia-class, a year-long CR scenario jeopardizes the awarding of the second FY11 boat, which in turn jeopardizes the continuation of the FY09 to 13 multi-year procurement contract, which is a major source of cost constraint on those boats. Those boats would be subject to having price renegotiation, and the cost of those boats could go up, which would undermine a lot of the savings that were to have been achieved as a result of the multi-year plan. The scenario of a year-long CR would also cause a problem potentially in the Ohio replacement program, because the amount of R&D funding requested for that program in FY11 was about 40% more than the amount that was provided in FY10. And so if R&D work on the Ohio replacement boat was funded in FY11 at FY10 levels, it would probably cause the Navy to postpone some of the work that had been planned for FY11 into a future year. That could set back the development schedule for the Ohio replacement boat and make it more difficult for the Navy to meet what the Navy says is its very tight schedule for completing the development of that boat in time to support an FY19 lead ship procurement, which the Navy says is the last year that you can think about procuring a lead boat without causing, at some point, the boomer force to drop below 12 boats at some point in the future.
Not good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Whitman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Labs, Mr. O'Rourke, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your service to our nation. Dr. Labs, I want to begin with you. In your written testimony, you talk about the CBO estimate for the Navy shipbuilding plan at 313 ships, and you say that essentially it's about $3 billion short of being able to meet that 313-ship Navy. In your opinion, where does that fall short as far as their cost estimates, and where do we end up at the current level of funding as far as total number of ships?
Mr. Whitman, that, in terms of where they fall short, there's no one particular place. It's across most of the shipbuilding programs that there's just some cases very incremental differences between us, and other cases larger ones. The boomers being one example under that plan, there's $1 billion worth of difference. The carriers, there's about $2 billion worth of difference per carrier, but there's only a half a dozen carriers in the plan. There was other programs that we were very similar. Virginia-class program cost estimates and the Navy's, CBOs and the Navy's are virtually identical now. So it just depends. So it all kind of accumulates over a 30-year period. If the Navy is stuck with sort of the $15 billion a year sort of current level of shipbuilding, as I mentioned earlier, how that would fall out in terms of the long-term inventory of the fleet by 2030, 2040 would depend very much on where cuts would be made? Would you be making it in very expensive ships? Would you be making it in less expensive ships, or some mix of the two? Obviously, if you cut out a lot of the cheap stuff, you could have a Navy that falls to 200 ships. If you cut an aircraft carrier and maybe a couple of ballistic missile submarines, you save a lot of money in a big way, and so you don't cut nearly as many ships from the inventory. So it would depend. The range is a considerable one, depending on what decisions are made.
But you also stated that the plan front loads the less expensive ships and back loads the more expensive ships. So under that scenario, would you say the way it's currently planned out that would have any necessary effects as far as what would actually be built according to the plan?
Because of that front loading, one could certainly surmise that when the boomers start being acquired in the 2020s, and that's where your real funding crunch hits, is that you are more likely going to be forced to cut more expensive ships in the plan, and that means destroyers and attack submarines most likely, simply because that's where the money is in that time period.
Mr. O'Rourke, under the current scenario, you look, there's some changes going on in the shipbuilding industry. You see what's happening with the Northrop Grumman yards and some of the uncertainties that are going on there. Can you give us your estimate based on this current change scenario that we're seeing with our yards, especially there at Northrop Grumman? What effect would that have on the Navy shipbuilding plan and their capability to carry out the shipbuilding plan?
In terms of assessing possible execution risks for the Navy shipbuilding plan, it's worth noting as a starting point that the yards in question that are currently owned by Northrop build many of the large and complex ships for the Navy: aircraft carriers, submarines, destroyers, and amphibious ships. And so there are a number of programs whose execution is something that you would want to watch as this divestiture occurs. The Navy's interests in what the new entity turns out to be, I think, would be principally, although not exclusively, twofold. First, I think they would want to ensure that the new entity has the managerial skills that are necessary to properly run these yards, and especially the nuclear shipbuilding activities at Newport News, over which the Navy, I think, has a particularly strong interest in making sure are run without problem. And to the extent that the Navy is satisfied with the current management team at these yards, the new entity can then seek to satisfy the Navy on those grounds by showing that these people will be transferred over to the new entity. The Navy, I think, also will have an interest in the financial strength of the new entity to make sure that it can absorb unforeseen losses that might occur on its shipbuilding program, and also have enough money to make the kinds of investments in workforce and capital plant that the entity would want to make to remain competitive against General Dynamics' yards. And so the Navy will be looking at the financial strength of the entity in that connection as well. Issues that in the press have been reported to be at issue as among the things that could affect the financial strength of the new entity include the questions of pension costs and the question of possible cleanup costs at Avondale should Avondale cease operations as an industrial facility entirely. If the new yard is encumbered in terms of managerial skills or financial strength, it could increase execution risks for the various kinds of ships that are built at these yards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Mr. Kritz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Rourke, you had mentioned that I guess it's the 2006 313 ship Navy plan is, for lack of, or for using rough language, no longer the valid figure that that's being talked about, that the Navy is going to revisit that and come back with an adjusted number, which I think you mentioned is probably in the 320, 321 ship range. Now, is that something that you foresee, you estimate, or is that something that you're hearing is that's the direction the Navy's going?
It's what I'm hearing. The Navy has actually stated that publicly in some of their testimony this year, and they've also communicated that in briefings, that they do expect to be coming forward relatively soon, although exactly what that means I don't know, with a new replacement plan. But I do think from the standpoint of ensuring the effectiveness of congressional oversight of Navy shipbuilding, it would facilitate that oversight to have an updated plan that has a fully accurate set of numbers against which to measure the Navy's proposed programs.
Okay, and Dr. Labs, you had mentioned that we're about $3 billion short a year. Now, and I'm trying to figure this out. I'm a little confused because obviously the shipbuilding plan that we've seen ranges from 313 down to about 280, 285. That there's these hills and valleys. Now, the $3 billion short, will that, in your estimation, hit the 285 number, or is that to get to the 313 ship level?
The $3 billion shortfall is in reference to what I stated in my written testimony is against this implied, what I call the implied requirement that the Navy has not officially signed up to, but they've talked about another things of around 322, 323 ships. Okay. So it's against that requirement, sir.
Now, the 320, 322 ship, there's obviously some issues that it seems that the Navy's a little shy on amphibious ships. Does this extra 8 to 9 ships address the amphibious issues?
In general, no. The changes in the plan that Eric and I have been tracking over the last 5 years do not contemplate moving beyond the 33 ships, although it did move it from 31 up to 33. But if you've been briefed on this higher 38 number, Eric and I have not seen, I don't think, any evidence to show that a new set of numbers will necessarily go to 38. I think it's going to stay at 33.
If you look at under the 2011 plan, which is the last 30-year plan that we had, the Navy reaches 33 amphibious ships about sort of midway in the period for about 8 or 9 years, as I recall, and then it falls below that thereafter. It's important to note that between the 2009 and 2011 shipbuilding plans, the Navy actually reduced the number of ships they were purchasing. Their implied requirement went up to 322 or so, but the number of ships that they were going to purchase to try to meet that requirement went down, so that, as I said earlier, after around the mid part of the period, you fall below the requirement. You don't return to it, beyond 2040.
Is it in your estimation that the Navy is looking at it in financial terms or in actual needs of the Navy? Are they trying to, in essence, predict what the Congress will be able to appropriate and then trying to fit their number within that? Or is this actually a reevaluation of the true needs of our Navy?
It's hard for me to sort of know, what is the motivation of the Navy on that part. Certainly, Navy officials have stated, in terms of discussing at least the 2011 plan, that they were mindful of trying to put together what they called an affordable shipbuilding plan. And they also have begun to discuss the issue of sort of how do you pay for the ballistic missile submarine when in the 2020s, when there will be severe pressure on the Navy shipbuilding budget. At the same time, they have stated this implied requirement of 322 ships, 313 plus some additional extra. So how they're balancing those two, I can't tell you for sure.
Okay, thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony today. While we're on the shipbuilding budget, I'd like to just turn to the Navy's decision to restart the DDG 51 line versus purchasing more of the DDG 1000s. The Navy obviously is basing the decision on a set of assumptions that they can restart the DDG 51 line as well as incorporate all the enhanced capabilities that it's going to need versus going with more of the 1000s. Can you give us your assessment of how that decision is playing out and what the cost assumptions are in terms of the restart of the line, and are those figures on target?
When the Navy first announced their desire to do this in July of 2008, they put forward a few arguments, and these arguments have evolved a little bit over the 2 or 3 years that have elapsed since then. But essentially, if I were to take what the Navy has said and boil it down, I would say that what the Navy decided to do was to move to a destroyer procurement plan that, in their view, better met future mission emphases within the amount of money they had available, while also maximizing the number of hulls that they could get for that money. Now, in terms of how that question is playing out, that is going to depend on what the construction cost turns out to be for these restart DDG-51s. And the higher that cost turns out to be, then I think the more pressure the Navy might come under in terms of defending that decision. But the way the Navy looked at it at the time and estimated the costs of restarting the 51 versus continuing the 1000 and modifying the 1000 into a design that would more closely meet these changed mission needs, using the numbers they had at the time, that is what led them into that decision. But we don't have a lot of evidence yet on what the restart 51s will actually cost to build, because we're just getting into that now.
Okay. In terms of the Navy being able to incorporate, I should say the 51 line being able to incorporate all the enhanced capabilities it's going to need to meet, for example, missile defense needs, is that going to be an effective decision? And I guess maybe I'll point to the fact that the Navy plans obviously to replace its Ticonderoga class cruisers with the DDG-51 lines modified to the Flight 3 configuration. In order to incorporate the larger and more powerful radar, the Navy will have to increase the amount of power and cooling to the radar. And my question is, on this particular thing is, what is your assessment of risks to the Navy being able to accommodate the new radar on Flight 3 ships, and what alternatives do you see as options for the Navy meeting missile defense requirements if the Navy is unable to do so?
Yes, I understand what you mean now. You're referring to the Flight 3 ships that are scheduled to go into procurement starting in FY16. There are a few risks that the Navy faces and which they have to manage and overcome. One is they need to develop the air and missile defense radar on a schedule that would be congruent with the first of these ships being procured in FY16. There have been some observers who have expressed concerns about the ability of the radar to be developed on a schedule sufficient for that. If the radar turns out to take longer to develop than what the Navy anticipates, the Navy can manage that risk by simply putting off the start of Flight 3 procurement into a future year and continuing to procure Flight 2A DDG-51s. There's a second challenge that the Navy faces, which is can they put the radar and the other new or revised equipment into the existing DDG-51 hull, including the power generation and cooling equipment that you mentioned, without lengthening the hull. The early indications that I get from the Navy is they think they can do that. If that does not turn out to be possible and they have to lengthen the hull and turn it into a slightly longer ship, then that could result in a design that is more expensive than what the Navy might be anticipating. And the third risk concerns the capability that you wind up with once you develop this ship and begin procuring it and introducing it into the fleet, and the aggregate capability that the Navy has as a result for air and missile defense operations. The Navy made a decision to go ahead with the Flight 3 ship instead of the CGX cruiser, reportedly in part because they concluded that they would be able in the future to augment the data collected by the ship's radar with data collected by off-board sensors. Now, if it turns out, for example, that these off-board sensors are not as capable as what the Navy anticipated when they originally made their decision, then it would raise the question of what your other options might be to augment the data on the Flight 3 destroyer with data collected by certain other now off-board sensors. One option for that would be to build an adjunct radar ship, which is a ship and auxiliary with a very large and powerful radar on it, somewhat similar perhaps to the Coda Judy replacement ship. And some small number of these adjunct radar ships might be put into the shipbuilding plan and added to the fleet to make up for any deficiency that might emerge in the amount of off-board data that is available to be merged with the data collected by the Flight 3 destroyer's own radar. Two other things to look for in the Flight 3 destroyer is whether the Navy intends to design that ship to support an electromagnetic railgun, because the Navy has recently stated that that weapon has the potential for air and missile defense operations, not just for naval surface fire support, and whether the Flight 3 destroyer will be designed to support a higher power solid-state laser, like a solid-state laser with a power of 200 to 300 kilowatts. a laser of that strength could have air defense applications and could help reverse the cost-exchange ratio that the Navy now faces in terms of trying to shoot down targets at an affordable cost. So these are issues that are potential matters of oversight concern for the subcommittee as the Navy begins to get into the design of the Flight 3 destroyer. And it's my understanding from the Navy that they are going to begin preliminary design work on the Flight 3 destroyer during FY12.
I see my time has expired, but thank you for your testimony.
Mr. Larson? Ms. Davis?
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I'm sorry that I wasn't here earlier, but I wanted to go back to the question of how many ships are being built and when we can reach the desired numbers. And I know you've had concerns for some time that the Navy perhaps was underestimating the cost of those ships. Excuse me. And could you expound a little bit more on what you think really ends up being the problem? Is it a question of our failure to rein in spending in the shipbuilding accounts per se, that it's a difficult thing to do? What role does the Congress play? I know that in many cases there is a real desire to have some of the shipbuilding contracts more front-loaded, so there's consistency in terms of work being done in a timely fashion. What are some of the things that you believe are really the issue here? And if we are taking so much time, I think, to get to where we want to go, it seems that other priorities that we might have that come along really get put on the back burner in a fashion that might not be helpful. And I'm trying to figure out how we deal with that question.
In terms of the, what is sort of at the root cause of why there are differences between the Navy's costs of ships and sort of CBOs, or why ships are so expensive, if I understand that is sort of the core of your question. I think there are a myriad of factors that are going into this. For one thing is that the shipbuilding industry itself is proving to be it's an expensive industry. Labor and materials cost a lot more, as we've seen in the economy as a whole. So that adds to the cost of the ships. The rates at which we buy these ships, are relatively small, and that's going to force more overhead costs in the yard into those ships. The desire for a high degree of requirements on the ships, that we make them more and more capable, has been driving up the cost of the ships. And indeed, that was partly what motivated the rise of the LCS program, was the desire to find a ship that was less expensive and more affordable, that the Navy could buy in numbers to do a lot of the sort of the day-to-day routine type of operations, so you're not sending a destroyer to chase down a drug runner or something like that. So there's a whole host of issues that sort of go into that. I personally can't sort of pinpoint necessarily one or two that's doing it. I'm not saying, and I would certainly not.
I don't expect a silver bullet. I'm just trying to make sure that we're asking the right questions in some cases in terms of oversight, and whether there's just a real disconnect there in terms of what's really needed for the job and what perhaps is being put into the budget. So I think the other thing, just to follow up really quickly, is the other issue really is one of the line items that a lot of the procurement of the Navy ships require. And I think the issue of flexibility, while we're not able to move some of that funding as well, does that in fact contribute to this problem, or is it part of the problem that we're not able to do that in as timely a fashion perhaps as we should?
Well, that's a problem clearly under the scenario of a year-long CR, because funding for shipbuilding, unlike funding that is appropriated for other defense appropriation accounts, is not funded at the full account or lump sum level. It's funded at the line item level, and therefore it's managed by the Navy at that level. And as the Navy has pointed out, even though the total shipbuilding request for FY11 was only about $1.9 billion higher than the total amount provided in FY10, the funding is misaligned at the line item level if you were to try to meet the specific needs of shipbuilding programs in FY11. And so for FY11 programs that would require a funding increase over the FY10 level, the shortfall or the misalignment, if you will, of these funds totals about $5.6 billion. So whether it's done as a special provision in the CR or through some freestanding piece of legislation, the Navy would need transfer authority so that it could move this funding in a way that better aligns that would better align the amount of FY10 funding with the specific line item needs of FY11 shipbuilding programs. And they would also need authority for quantity increases as well. This is sometimes referred to as the New Start Authority, but you can also just call it authority for a quantity increase.
So you would suggest trying to figure out a way to change this?
Whether it's done as a part of a year-long CR or through some other legislative vehicle, the Navy has made it clear that these are the two forms of authority that would go a long way, although not entirely, but a long way toward mitigating the challenges they would face in executing their FY11 shipbuilding programs.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to have you back again, Mr. O'Rourke. You did a wonderful job last hearing. This was a month ago or so. Very good. Mr. Lundgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Rourke, time had run out before I was able to get to what I'd like to have as a second sort of follow-up part of our discussion. In all the things that you laid out in terms of analysis of alternatives that the Navy is going to have to go through, being able to incorporate the new enhanced capabilities, particularly amount of power and cooling on the radar, I want to know, in your estimation, can all of these enhanced capabilities be easily added to and incorporated by the DDG 1000 versus the 51?
The most amount of work I think that would be needed, or the biggest single piece of work I think that would be needed to modify the DDG 1000 to better meet these changed mission emphases that the Navy has in mind, would be to give the DDG 1000 a BMD capability. And to do that, they would need to do a lot of code writing to put a new module into the ship's computer programming for BMD operations, and they might also need to make changes to the radar, especially because they've taken away one part of the dual-band radar that the ship was supposed to carry, and they would need to do some rewiring in the VLS cells on the ship. But it would be especially the modifications to the combat system and to the computer program to include a module that is not there right now for doing BMD operations that might be the single largest change that the Navy would have to contemplate making to that ship. There would be other changes as well. The baseline question is, could that ship be modified into a design that would meet the Navy's newly changed areas of mission emphasis? And the answer is yes, and there would be a certain cost for doing that. The Navy reviewed those costs as part of the destroyer hull radar study. They briefed Eric and I on that. It was the Navy's conclusion that they preferred to do this through the DDG 51 line rather than through modifying a 1000.
But there would be less physical modifications that would need to be made to 1000 versus physical design changes that would need to be made to the 51 to do the same mission.
I guess I would answer by saying that the 1000 has a lot more growth margin on it than the 51 hull does at this point, because the growth margin on the 51 hull is already partially consumed.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. It's sorry I'm a little bit late getting here. I was just up at the Budget Committee, and they're thinking of all kinds of dastardly things to do to the defense budget, so we were doing some battle up there. And I think because the fact we have another set of witnesses coming, I'm going to pass up the questions. I have the luxury of being able to ask a lot of these questions to staff and to those of you simply want to need them. So I'm just going to pass that up and thank you all for joining us and for all the good work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let's go ahead and take a 2-minute recess, and we'll send the next panel up. Sean, do you want to go first, or were you going to have some of your witnesses? Why don't you choose whoever wants to go first and proceed?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today with Vice Admiral Blake and Lieutenant General Flynn to discuss Navy shipbuilding. And thank you, of course, for your steadfast support to our sailors and Marines and your commitment. I have an opening statement for the combined team here. I would propose to submit a longer statement for the record and go to our shorter.
That'd be fine. Submit it for the record and then go ahead with your opening.
Yes, sir. Today's Navy.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. Today's Navy is a battle force of 288 ships, as many as half of which are underway on any given day, providing presence and maintaining readiness to respond to crisis or conflict wherever our interests are challenged. And our Navy's ability to reliably meet the demands that come with global presence and readiness rely upon three enduring qualities: the size of the force, measured in numbers of ships and aircraft, the capabilities designed and built into these ships and aircraft, and the skill, dedication, and resourcefulness of our sailors and Marines who put to sea in these ships and aircraft. The Chief of Naval Operations and the Commandant of the Marine Corps have defined the force necessary to meet our naval requirements in what has been referred to as the 313-ship Navy. In fact, the CNO has emphasized that 313 ships is the floor. So to this end, the fiscal year 2012 budget request includes funding for 10 ships. Equally important, the shipbuilding program includes 55 ships to be constructed over the 5 years of the 2012 Future Years Defense Plan, an increase of 5 ships over the plan of a year ago. This increase reflects a priority placed on building the force called for by the 313-ship plan and reflects efforts to improve affordability within our shipbuilding program, efforts which must be sustained and which must prove effective if we are to succeed in recapitalizing ship classes which were constructed during the buildup of the 600-ship Navy. Our budget request supports the Navy's build plan to deliver a new carrier every 5 years while also refueling the Nimitz class, sustaining an 11-carrier force from the commissioning of CVN 78 through to 2041. We continue with Virginia-class fast attack submarine procurement at 2 boats per year. Sustaining this build rate is essential to recapitalization of our submarine force, essential to affordability on the program, and essential to ramping up the critical skills of our submarine industrial base as we approach construction of our next fleet ballistic missile submarine. We sustained DDG-51 production, which adds both capability and capacity to our sea-based missile defense. We've been able to increase our plan for DDG-51 construction with the addition of a 2014 destroyer, which, with a planned proposal for a multi-year procurement in 2013, will leverage the stability of this mature production program, improve build rates for our 2 combatant shipbuilders, and improve affordability. Our Aegis modernization efforts are equally critical to rapidly increasing capacity in missile defense, serving to increase the number of missile defense platforms from 21 today to 41, 36 ready for tasking by the end of the fit-up, while also improving their material condition to meet readiness demands in the second half of their service lives. With the strong support of this subcommittee, we're executing the dual award strategy for the littoral combat ship, increasing our build rate to 4 ships per year in 2012, efforts to stabilize design, improve production planning, invest in shipbuilder improvements, and leverage long-term vendor agreements, all within the framework of a competitive fixed-price contract, have returned this program to the level of affordability necessary for the Navy to move forward with construction at efficient rates in support of the 55-ship LCS requirement. We increase our amphibious lift capability with the procurement of the 11th LPD-17 class ship and are extending service of the USS Peleliu to maintain 9 operationally available large-deck amphibious ships while awaiting fleet introduction of the lead ship of the America-class LHA-6. We're also increasing our logistics lift capability with procurement of the second of 3 mobile landing platform class ships, or MLPs, and a joint high-speed vessel. With the 2012 budget request, the Navy has effectively accelerated the MLP program to 1 ship per year, which should significantly improve affordability for this class while also directly addressing the workload valley confronting the shipbuilder. In the second half of this decade, we'll need to proceed with recapitalization of 3 major ship programs. As announced last fall, we are accelerating introduction of our next fleet oiler with procurement of the TAOX beginning in 2014. TAOX will bring modern commercial design to our refueling at sea capabilities while also providing critical stability to an important sector of our industrial base. We plan to commence procurement of the replacement for the LSD-41 class amphibious ships in 2017, following definition of lift requirements for this new ship class. Most significantly, we will procure the lead ship of the Ohio-class replacement in 2019. It has been a quarter century since completing Ohio-class construction, and it is vital that we sustain development activities for the next ballistic missile submarine with sufficient lead times to ensure our ability to produce this highly complex, uniquely capable ship on schedule. It is equally vital that we address cost risk on this program through every stage of its development, or we place other ship programs at risk. To this end, we have carefully defined the capabilities necessary to ensure the ship's ability to meet its requirements, and we have embarked on a focused design for affordability effort to capitalize on lessons learned of the Virginia program at a much earlier stage in the Ohio replacement program. The Navy's shipbuilding program outlines the challenges we confront today and for the long term in meeting our Navy's force structure requirements. In the most pragmatic terms, in balancing requirements, risk, and realistic budgets, affordability controls our numbers. So to this end, we're focusing on bringing stability to the shipbuilding program, finding the affordable 80% solution when 80% meets the need. We're strengthening our acquisition workforce, increasing not just our numbers, but our core competency in critical skills. We're increasing emphasis and fidelity on cost estimates in our requirements definition process to better inform critical decisions at the front end to avoid breakage on the back end. We're continuing to improve our ability to affordably deliver combat capability to the fleet through open architecture. We're clamping down on contract design changes, and we're placing greater emphasis on competition and fixed-price contracts. The benefits of competition are compelling in every example. Our goals for modernizing today's force and recapitalizing the fleet affordably cannot be accomplished without strong performance by our industry partners. And so we're working to benchmark performance, to identify where improvements are necessary, to provide proper incentives for capital investments where warranted, and to reward sustained strong performance with favorable terms and conditions. Now, bringing stability to the shipbuilding program also relies on stable budgets. So as we work with Congress on our 2012 budget requests, it is important to emphasize that there's an underlying assumption that the ships in our 2011 budget request will be fully funded. While executing our shipbuilding plan for 2011, we're making prudent decisions to mitigate the impacts of operating under a continuing resolution. However, we are rapidly approaching decision points where, absent necessary funding and new start appropriations, we will run out of line and need to pull back sharply on key programs. Specifically, 2011 is the first year we increase our build rate for Virginia to 2 boats per year. Likewise, we requested an increase to construct two Arleigh Burke destroyers in 2011. And the mobile landing platform and LHA-7 amphibious assault ship are each a new start in 2011. As well, funding limitations on development of the Ohio replacement and CVN-78 class construction place those program schedules at risk. Virtually every shipbuilding program and every shipbuilder is affected by the uncertainty of our top line and the absence of a line item appropriation. In sum, the Department is committed to building the fleet required to support the National Defense Strategy, to which the FY 2012 budget request addresses near-term capability needs while also laying the foundation for long-term requirements. Ultimately, we recognize that as we balance requirements, affordability, and industrial-based considerations, it is vital that we, Navy and industry, improve affordability within our programs in order to build the 313-ship Navy needed by the future force. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. First of all, just in terms of the problems worked by the continuing resolution, a number of us on this committee have been working to see what we can do, as we talked about, and I think there would be continued support to try to provide you with the new starts and things that are necessary to keep things running at least in a somewhat orderly fashion. So we'll continue to work on that, and that we'll have to do offline, I suppose, as different things develop and depending how negotiations work out. But we are aware of those problems, and particularly the problem that seems to be affecting shipbuilding and the new starts and all is absolutely critical. And I think there's at least some level of good support, particularly in the Armed Services Committee overall. And I know Buck is working on that as well. So, the second thing, I was just curious about one of the things we've been paying attention to is the EMALS system on new carrier, and that has to be built into the hull and everything. And I gather the timeline on that's pretty tight. How is that going, and do you see any problems with that or not?
Yes, sir. We have been managing emails to the smallest detail. We were very concerned about 2 years ago that the program was not on track. We've placed basically we have replaced the management team as well as ensure that the program is properly funded, both to complete its development and also to support the in-yard need dates for the CVN 78. Today we're at a point in system development that we have turned over to the shipyard what's referred to as the Green Book, which takes all the testing that's been conducted up at Lakehurst, where we have a full-scale model in the ground that we've used to launch aircraft. So we've developed the test requirements, turned over that Green Book to Newport News on schedule so that they can continue to build the CVN 78 to support the test program. On the production side, we are carefully watching each of the components that need to be delivered to Newport News. We have 2 in particular, 2 motor generator sets out of 12 that have very limited float on the in-yard need date, but we don't see difficulties right now in terms of meeting that, and all the other components have float on the order of 4 to 6 months. So tight, yes. Closely managed, yes. Do I think the risk is acceptable? Absolutely. We have yet to complete the SDD testing. As I described, we had launched aircraft off the Lakehurst system in December to really do stress it and to drive learning early on. And coming out of that, in fact, we have uncovered some dynamics associated between the system and the aircraft's performance that we've taken a pause to work on more on the software side of correcting that issue, so that we can
software in order to change the amount of force relative to distance that the system develops, or?
No, sir. What's beautiful about emails is it's very scalable in terms of you dial in the load that you're putting on it and what you want for speed when at the end of the runway, and emails will do the rest. What we discovered in moving away from a dead load to an F-18 is emails is it's a number of linear motors that are in series. And in the handoff from linear motor to linear motor as the aircraft is accelerating, there's a slight gap. And that can be tuned in terms of the way you ramp up the load and then the way you drop it off to minimize that gap so it's not perceptible to the pilot. So that's an example of what we were not able to pick up in dead load testing, but you put a pilot on an aircraft. And that's a report that we received back, and so we dived into that to figure out what's the best way to mitigate that so that it's not a problem. So the test program, bottom line is the test program is, frankly, in good shape. It is a fairly exhaustive test program. We did take a pause because we did not, while we were working on these changes or corrections coming out of the live aircraft testing, we did not want to have a standing army on the test side that was performing inefficiently. So we took a pause. We're coming back with corrections and picking back up the system functional demonstration this month.
Sounds good. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Stackley and the witnesses for being here today. Secretary Stackley, I want to also particularly applaud the work that you've done with this CR crisis, really, in terms of these New START programs. Obviously, the Block 3 contract for Virginia class was supposed to have been funded at the end of January, and you worked with EB and Northrop Grumman to sort of, again, extend that requirement, which the clock is still ticking, obviously. Your testimony over the years here in terms of the presidential helicopter and now this issue, I mean, again, I think a lot of us really appreciate how sort of level-headed and unflappable you usually are with a lot of these problems. Your language that you just used, however, a few moments ago, saying that if this CR goes out through the rest of this year, that you will have to, quote, pull back sharply from the new starts, which, I mean, that, again, given your, again, approach to things, I mean, can you describe what that means in a little more detail in terms of, I mean, really, at some point, this is going to result in shipyards having to pull back sharply in terms of their workforce and obviously pull back sharply in terms of our fleet growth.
Yes, sir. Let me describe a couple of things. First, the effort to minimize the impact of the CR is a collective effort between the Navy and industry and frankly, dialogue with Congress in particular areas. Some of the challenges that we have in 2011, first, we do have new starts that bind us. Second, as you're all aware, we are increasing our investment in shipbuilding. So, in fact, the 2011 shipbuilding account is above our 2010 numbers. So when we're executing at 2010 levels, then we don't have enough headroom or top line to support our 2011 requirements. So we need both the top line amount as well as the authorities to go with the new starts. Now, in terms of contract execution and efficiency, frankly, what I focus on is the start fab date program by program. Because if you line everything up to support the start fab date, then you will minimize any cost impacts, so neither the government nor industry has a real issue. So where we have things like advanced procurement or some amount of funding that allows us to proceed with planning and ordering material to support start fab and construction, then we're okay. Where we start to run into trouble is when we come up to that start fab date. If we don't have full funding, then you have some significant impacts. And there are a number of programs where we're challenged right now. Mobile landing platform is the first one that comes to mind. We had advanced procurement in 2010, so we're able to expend that, and we're doing it smartly. But we're going to come up to a point where we don't have any further advanced procurement funding, and now we've got a bridge to cross. In the case of the Virginia, the start fab, we have the first Virginia under contract. The start fab for the second Virginia in 2011 is actually in the October timeframe. So it's perilously close, and we have to, like I say, manage the planning and material support to ensure we don't miss that start fab date, or there will be impacts to construction and impacts to the workforce. So program by program, you go down the line, and if you look at where you need to start fab, and if you have sufficient funding to support that in the near term, then we're pressing on. But ultimately, we need both authorities and that increase in the top line that goes with our 2011 request.
Again, as the chairman said, I mean, all of us are doing what we can to try and avoid that at all costs. The Ron O'Rourke and Dr. Labs testified a short time ago about the out-year shortfalls, even with, we're hitting all cylinders here in terms of the increase in shipbuilding. And in particular, they talked about the fact that in 2024, Admiral, the submarine fleet is going to fall below that 48-ship sort of target that the Navy has repeatedly said is needed for mission requirements. One issue which was pointed out with the earlier panel was the 2018 issue of whether we buy one or two submarines. I just wonder if you could comment in terms of what benefit that would have if we were able to make it to two in terms of that shortfall.
Well, if you are able to make it to 2, you would of course mitigate the situation to some degree, because you'd be able to bring that boat online when the shortfall starts. But I think if you take it in a larger context, the challenge you have with the SCN account, in particular with buying that second boat, is you have to, if you will, you'll have to come up with around $1 billion in the years preceding the buy, in 14, 15, 16, and 17, in order to get economic order quantity as well as your advanced procurement. And then you'd have to come up with the dollars in 18 in order to be able to buy that boat. And what really complicates it is the fact that you've got the SSBNX, which we're putting the R&D into for our strategic forces, competing at that time. And of course, as you are well aware, we have brought that number in within our top line as we were directed to do last year. So when you look at it from that perspective, just in the submarines alone, and not just to take it in isolation, but then you've also got the balance, because we've also got issues, as you're well aware, with the surface combatants, both and as well as our amphib force. So when you take it in that context, it's not an easy. It's not a. You can't just take the issue in isolation. You've got to take it across the entire portfolio and then deal with it.
Okay, Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, this is to the Secretary. It's our understanding that the Department of the Navy officials agree that a 38-ship amphibious force would more fully meet the Marine Corps' 2 Marine Expeditionary Brigade amphibious echelon lift requirement. Such a force would include 17 amphibious ships for each Marine Expeditionary Brigade, plus 4 additional ships to account for 10% to 15% of the amphibious ships force being in overhaul at any given time. What risk is associated with maintaining the Navy's current plan of a 33-ship amphibious force?
Yes, sir. Let me start by describing the 38-ship number has been an enduring requirement, and today we're at 30. So we are the determination has been that 33 ships would meet the requirement with acceptable risk. What we're intending to do inside of the 313-ship plan, and by the end of this fit-up, if you look at the details inside the fit-up, is to get back up to a 33-ship amphibious force that's made up of notionally 11 big deck amphibs, 11 LPD-17 class ships, and then 11 LSD-4149 or their replacements. Where the risk comes in, and I'm probably going to turn this over to General Flynn to discuss the risk piece, is associated with how much of the lift requirement you take to the fight with you. So if you're dealing with a 2 MEB assault, if you have 30 amphibs that are operationally available, you're not going to be able to bring the full table of equipment associated with 2 MEB, and what the Marine Corps looks at is some of the support elements coming in a follow-on echelon.
General Flynn.
Yes, sir. As Mr. Stackley said, the 38 ships would give you 17 ships per brigade, and we believe that we could effectively, because of the fiscal constraints we have, we could do the assault echelon and load it out on 15 ships. The other key part of that is it's just not for the major contingency operation. It's also, we believe, with 33 ships, with an acceptable degree of risk, you can meet the day-to-day requirements that we're seeing in regards to presence and crisis response. But if you don't have that on a day-to-day operations, what you run into is you run in challenges to ensure that you have sufficient dwell time for the crews, time for maintenance, and then your ability to meet emergent requirements. Because right now what we're seeing, based on the number of actions that we're having to respond to, is that we are stressing the force, and we're meeting the requirements, but that's where your risk would be, and your ability to continue to meet the demands.
Thank you. General Flynn, LHA 6, the next amphibious ship to be delivered to the Navy, is more than 1 year late past its planned delivery date. What impact does this have in meeting Marine Corps lift requirements?
Well, sir, as Mr. Stackley said, we're on course to make 33 ships here starting in 17. A key part of that is when the plans were built, there was an idea behind when a ship would reach its expected service life and then when a new construction ship would come on. So if there are delays in new construction, you then also pressurize the need to be able to do maintenance on ships to be able to continue their mission. And for example, because of the continuing resolution right now, one of the challenges we have is the Peleliu was supposed to begin a yard period about a week ago, and if we don't have the funding to be able to do that, the Peleliu is the ship that is going to help us bridge the delay in construction in the LHA-6.
Vice Admiral Blake, due to the continuing resolution, the amphibious ship Peleliu's maintenance availability was recently canceled. Furthermore, the Navy plans to extend the Peleliu's decommissioning date by 1 year in 2014. What impact will this missed maintenance availability have on meeting the Marine Corps' lift requirements, and what options are being planned to mitigate this issue?
Well, sir, first, when you look at it, what we will have to do is we will have to look at the ships as they're coming up on these avails, and then we will have to juggle them because of the loading within the yards. So it's not just that there's a yard open and we can, if you will, push Peleliu in. But it goes to even a bigger issue. Peleliu is only one of 5 ships that will not be going in the yards by the end of this month as the CR continues. So it goes across the entire force. In the case of Peleliu, what we're looking at right now is extending her an additional year, as you know, in order to, because of the late delivery of her replacement. And what we will have to do is then juggle the global requirements in order to make sure that we're able to meet all our commitments worldwide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Kritz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to follow along the lines of Mr. Kaufman's questions concerning the amphib ship lift. I'm assuming that 33 ships is what we're headed for, has the risk, but it's only the risk gets greater if we go to a high up-tempo sort of thing. So is that, do I understand correctly that 38 is the ideal, 33 we can live with, but if we end up with high levels of activity, that's where we would see the issues?
So I think it's fair to say that with 33, we should be able to meet all levels of activity with an acceptable degree of risk, because sooner or later, you have to make choices on your requirement, and we believe that we can meet all the requirements with 33 ships.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, you had mentioned earlier that 313 fleet ship force is the floor, I think is the terminology you used. And we were listening to testimony earlier that the Navy is actually going to probably come back with a level that's more like 320, 321, 322 is the ideal number. Is that something that we're going to be hearing about in the near future, or is this all just rumor?
First, I want to attribute the term the floor to the CNO. And in terms of any future force structure assessment, I think Admiral Blake should probably address that.
Sir, we, in fact, during the past year have done a force structure assessment, and what we are currently doing is working through the leadership both on the Department of the Navy side and the Department of the Defense side. And I expect that we should be delivering that in the near future as soon as we go through the wickets with the leadership.
Okay. Thank you. And so based on what the CNO said, as 313 is the floor, I'm looking at the 30-year plan of what the inventory is going to be, and it seems like there's quite a lot of years where we're well below the 313, and I'm trying to figure out as we look forward, is this something that we need to start addressing now to maintain that 313 floor?
Yes, sir. Let me try to break this up into a couple pieces. First, when the 313 ship requirement was established, which goes back to 2005, that was not 313 in 2013. That was looking out to the 2020s, because at the time we had a 270 ship 276-ship Navy. So it was forward-looking to basically give us the ability to build up the force structure. And if you take the long-term plan, if you just look at the 30-year plan that the Navy delivered to Congress last year, and break it down to 3 periods, so the first decade is really a build-up period. And that's where you see the Navy peaking out at about 324 ships in the 2020 timeframe. And that's good. Now, but at the same time, what you also see is the Ohio replacement program entering the picture. And that has a very significant impact on our ability to sustain the build rates that you see in this first decade of the 30-year period. We have worked with OSD to basically put together a plan that allows some top-line increase during the period of the Ohio replacement program construction to the tune of about $2 billion per year. But it is such a substantial program that it really does suppress build rates during that period. And so, in fact, what happens in the longer term is we start to come off of the peak of 324 ships as other shipbuilding programs are drawn down in numbers. So it is an extremely important concern on the part of the Department of the Navy. Our near-term focus, I think, is exactly correct in terms of trying to drive affordability and stability into our plans. We have a midterm issue of having to, one, ensure that the Ohio replacement program does not escape in terms of cost, and then, two, within our top line, work priorities and to the extent possible, affordability to minimize the impact on the longer term. But we don't hesitate to describe the concern and the impacts to meeting our requirements in the long term associated with that.
And before my time runs out, just so I have sort of a full understanding, the 313 ship level is a level that's a goal, and it's a level that's based on our national security interest. Would that be correct?
I'm probably going to share this response with Admiral Blake, but 313 is a requirement that was established that balances a couple of considerations. First is global presence. We have, today, we have 288 ships, 142 of them are underway today, and about half are underway at any given time, and of those, 40% of our ships are deployed. So we have to, in order to sustain global presence, you need a force structure size that allows the turnaround time and allows you maintenance and upkeep for your force. And then the other is response to a major combat operation. So balancing those two, you arrive at the makeup of the 313 ship force. That's requirements driven, and then in our shipbuilding plan, what you see is we'll call it fiscal constraints or budget reality. When you overlay on top of that requirement, what can we afford with reasonable expectations of future budgets, then the picture starts to emerge in terms of the buildup and then the long-term impact when the recapitalization of retiring ships just becomes too much in a limited period and has an impact on the overall size of the force.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Mr. Ridgell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Stackley, Admiral Blake, and General Flynn, thank you for your service to our country. And I have the real privilege of representing Virginia's 2nd Congressional District. And, of course, I like to think of it as the epicenter of our Navy, certainly on the East Coast, world's largest naval base, and Naval Air Station Oceana, and the Naval Amphibious Base at Little Creek. So the equipment that you procure and the ships that you're building, enable our men and women in uniform to accomplish the mission, and I'm grateful for your service in that regard. My question addresses the fiscal year 2011 continuing resolution and a program issue that I don't think has really been discussed and gotten the attention that it merits. It's my understanding that CVN 78, the Gerald R. Ford, was authorized to be funded incrementally over 4 years beginning in fiscal year 2008 with its procurement and finishing in fiscal year 2011. As I review the budget from FY10 for CVN 78, I know that approximately $737 million was appropriated by the Congress, and that amount is presumably a ceiling which the program is forced to live within while under this continuing resolution. And I further note that the fiscal year budget for CVN 78 was over $1.7 billion, so that leaves us, the math is pretty simple on that, a delta of over $1 billion. So, Mr. Secretary, I'd address this to you. What then is the Navy's plan for funding the rest of CVN 78 if you are forced to live within the continuing resolution? And as a slight follow-up there, is there any specific legislation or legislative authority that would be required by the Navy if that, in fact, is the case?
Yes, sir. In my opening remarks, I referred to both the CVN 78 and 79 construction impacts associated with the CR because we also have advanced procurement on the 79 that's affected in 2011. With regards to the fourth year of incremental funding on the 78, there's a $1 billion delta between the 10 CR levels and the 11 request. So two things would have to happen if we have to live within that cap in 2011. We'd have to have the balance of funding in 2012, and we'd have to have the authority that goes with an additional year of incremental funding. Today we're authorized 4 years incremental funding. We'd need that fifth year. The added funding doesn't come into the picture until about the 2013 time frame. So the funding that's in the program today gets us, including 2011 at 2010 levels, would get us into 2013, but we'd be getting into 2013 on fumes. So there is a shortfall. We'd have to have that restored in 2012. We'd have to have the authorities that go with that. And as you know, you have the 2012 budget request in your hand. So any program impact associated with the CR and shipbuilding, there's no room in 2012 unless you all make room for it to fix it in 2012 without creating a cascading impact on the total shipbuilding plan.
I appreciate your clarification on that. And what limited funds that we have, they're under stress because of operating under the CR. And I've met with senior Navy officers and procurement officials within the district, and we're going to do everything we can to straighten this out for you. It just pains me as a businessman who now serves in our Congress to see that it's just so in some ways almost irrational the way that we're going about this. So I assure you that I'm pursuing every option that I can, and I know my colleagues are as well. Thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
Ms. Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your service and for your testimony here today. I'm going to talk to you about something that we haven't heard yet here and may come as a surprise, but I think a key component of modernizing our infrastructure and preserving our military assets and saving money in the process, which we hear a lot about, saving money in the process, is adopting a robust corrosion prevention and mitigation strategy. And it's not a glamorous topic, but it's one that's worth our time and attention. And frankly, it's something that DoD is doing well because they have invested in the Office of Corrosion Policy and Oversight. It plays a really important role. Just to give people a little idea of the scope of corrosion and all of our branches, as well as all on our military assets, they all face unique sets of challenges when it comes to corrosion, but including the military as well as our roads, bridges, highways, water systems. I mean, corrosion has a cost of some $276 billion a year. $276 billion a year. And for those of us in this body, that's according to a GAO study, those of us in this body who are concerned about fiscal responsibility, it seems to me that one thing that I would enjoy you expounding a little bit upon is this DoD corrosion office that you have, because it's my understanding that there have been a number of demonstration projects, some 150 plus demonstration projects that show a return on investment of somewhere in the neighborhood of 55 to 1. So why is that important? Because it's important that we make cuts that are smart cuts, and we make investments that are smart investments to get us where we're going. There was specifically there was an article in the San Diego Business, I think, Journal it was, about the effects of corrosion causing us to retire, I believe it was the Spruance ships, at a much earlier date because of the lost ability to keep them viable because of the impact of corrosion. So in these days of continuing resolutions, and that's also another issue, isn't it? Because if you let things corrode and you don't have the money to fix them now, you sometimes lose the capacity to fix them later. So if you could just sort of expand upon how we might be smart in investing in these technologies up front and having that money recaptured down the road.
Yes, ma'am. At great risk, I'll start by saying that an old friend used an expression that if you want to get an argument out of me, you're going to have to change the subject. Corrosion control, I've seen extraordinary numbers in terms of the cost impact associated with corrosion on our ships and aircraft, to the tune of 40% of our maintenance dollars are tied to wrestling with corrosion issues. We do have a concerted effort. DOD, OSD has a chair, and each of the services contribute to a team that goes after best practices, investing in developing new techniques, looking at materials, and then how do we best implement these. We spend a lot of our time talking about affordability on the procurement side because we're trying to acquire our platforms, but we're placing much greater emphasis these days on life cycle cost because it is starting to dominate our ability to operate, maintain our ships and aircraft. And corrosion's a key part of that. So there's, inside my office, I have a corrosion czar that pegs to the OSD team and works across programs and systems commanders to target smart investments and to figure out how can we either accelerate on the what we call forward fit when we procure the platform, or what do we need to do on back fit in terms of maintenance and upgrade and also modernization. When we look at extending the service life for ships, a key part of 313 Ship Navy is holding on to the ships you got for their full service life. And in fact, we're looking at extending service lives on certain platforms. We don't have a prayer of doing that unless we get out in front of issues like corrosion. So right now, when we go through the Aegis modernization program, we're at the front end of the destroyers. So the Flight 1 destroyers have just entered Aegis modernization. And as we tear those ships down, we're getting a good material baseline to capture what the first half of their life's history is, but we're also looking at instrumenting so that as we go through and press on with upkeep for the Flight 1 ships, we're building the work package for the Flight 2A destroyers because those are the ships that we're looking to extend beyond their initial service life. And so we're using this period to figure out what are those investments that are required, what are the key areas of the ship that need the attention, and then ensuring that in the longer term the dollars are there and the efforts are there to meet the service life expectations. So you hit some large numbers in terms of the number of initiatives. There are a large number of initiatives that span from investments in paint teams just to help the crews maintain their ships, to selecting some pretty exotic materials in key areas where you don't have the ability to get at the point of corrosion, and so you really need to rely on higher tech solutions.
Thank you.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Steckley, General Flynn, Admiral Blake, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your service to our nation. Secretary Steckley, I want to pick up with your comment about this entire picture, and I want to put it in context of saying that I believe with the challenges this nation faces with its defense needs, at the very top of the list is Navy capacity. And capacity provides us the ability to project force, and 313 is the bottom line. Obviously, I think a larger number of ships is needed. The key is how do we get there? And I think it's critical that we get there. We talk about building ships. I want to go to your point about service life completion. If you look at it, it looks like the Navy is getting back to basics and saying, listen, we got to do the training. We have to make sure that the manning requirements are there, and so they're moving billets from land back to sea. And I think that's the proper response to what's been a failed optimal manning plan. If you look at where we need to go in the future, I think that I'm concerned in that I refuse to believe that that just happened overnight, that that realization was just there. To me, that should have happened sometime past, and that we've seen, I think, some history there where we've kicked the can down the road on maintenance and training. And I think that's finally coming to roost right now with where we need to be with this entire plan of fleet capacity. And with where we are with optimal manning and seeing that that has been put by the wayside, and where that decision-making has led us, I just want to know, why are we just now going to general quarters over this? And I want to know how long it's going to take for our fleet to get back on course. We're going to be conducting effective and thorough maintenance and materials management and making sure that we're providing the necessary training for sailors to make sure that we never get back to this position again. And we've seen some early signs of that, of those problems there. I want to make sure that we have a clear understanding about why it took us so long to get where we are and how we're going to avoid this in the future, because we do not get to the fleet capacity we need without making sure that we have a robust program for training, maintenance, and materials management.
Yes, sir. This is probably going to be a two-part answer where Admiral Blake is going to have part two. This is actually a fairly complex issue, and the CNO and Admiral Harvey, the Fleet Forces Commander, have spent a lot of time trying to get to the root of it and have launched a couple of key fleet reviews to get a better understanding of what are the root causes, what do they trace back to, how far back do we in fact have to go to start correcting the issues. And then you have a large population of issues. Now you have to prioritize it, and then you have to resource it. So several things emerged. One is we went through a long period of implementing a number of initiatives that would bring certain efficiencies from a budget perspective, but placed risk on the fleet in terms of care and maintenance of our ships. And they were done somewhat individually without a recognition of what the cumulative impact would be. And then over time, the issues started to manifest themselves. So in the course of the past, I'd say 1 to 2 years, we've been coming to grips with it and reversing some of those initiatives that were laid in place years ago. You mentioned some of the manning in terms of increasing our ship's manning. We're looking at everything across the board. You hit on training. That's a key element. Parts support. We're going back to ensure that in our attempt to reduce everything from inventory to just-in-time, we've got the right understanding of reliability-based sparing, so that whether it's a spy radar or whether it's an LM2500, when the trained sailor that's on board ship now goes to the parts bin, that he's got what he needs to keep the ship running. So we're looking across the board, trying to ensure we got the right priorities in place while we, and it's going to take time, while we resource the number of things that we need to resource to increase our readiness and reliability system by system, platform by platform.
The one thing I would add, I would say, as you had this series of initiatives taking place, I think if you looked back, you would say that not any one initiative taken in isolation would have a debilitating effect. But when taken in accumulation, we started seeing, if you will, the indications and warnings on the material inspection side. Principally, one of the principal ones being in-serve, where we would go aboard ships, and of course, in-serves are not done every year; they're done over a period of time. And so you didn't get the trend analysis until you started seeing them coming in, and then the question came up: why are these ships not doing well on in-serve? And then you had to focus on, all right, now that they have not done well, have we got a trend here? So then we had to look at it. And then we had to isolate it, and then we started, if you will, working our way back. You mentioned we're moving personnel from shore to sea. not only are we doing that, we're also putting a greater emphasis on eye-level maintenance down on the piers so that we can put more people there. We've increased the training. We've increased the dollars that we've put in maintenance because we recognize that if these ships are going to be able to make it to the end of their service lives, we've got to do that. And it's all the ships. The best example I can give you is the midlifes we're doing on the LSD 41 class. We have got to get those ships. We tailor those midlifes to each individual ship, so you'll have different amounts depending upon their material condition, and that is absolutely critical if we're to get those ships to the end of their expected service lives. Without that, you are going to see that ships will not be able to get there, which is as one of your members brought up earlier, why it's so critical to get these maintenance windows done as we're operating under the current CR.
Thank you. Mr. Longeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you, Admiral Blake and Secretary Stackley, General Flynn. Thank you all for your service to our country, extraordinary service, and everything you've had to say here today. I was away from the beginning part of this panel, so I apologize if my questions have already been asked. But Admiral Blake, I'd like to start with you, if I could, with respect to a follow-on to the Ohio-class submarine, the SSBN next. Officials within your organization have recently described some of the significant schedule and cost challenges that face the program. Considering the importance of our ballistic missile submarine force to our nuclear and strategic posture, obviously it's critically important that these boats be deployed on schedule. How confident are you that the Navy will meet its cost and schedule goals?
We have a very high confidence level that we're going to be able to meet both our cost and our schedule goals, and I'll give you a couple of specific examples why we feel that way. First of all, we are leveraging what has been done in the past in the earlier submarine programs, specifically the Virginia class. We are also leveraging for the SSBNX the D5 SLEP program. So we're not starting out new. We've got a proven program. We're going to do an extension on those, and we're going to be able to put a proven system on those ships. When I referred to the Virginia class, we specifically looked at not only their HM&E, hull maintenance and engineering, but also their combat system suite, and we leveraged off those programs in order to apply them to the SSBNX. We recognize that we have to have an SSBNX on station, certified, ready to go in 2029. And I think we have, and we also realize that in order to do that, we've got to start in 2019 with the building of the first ship in that class. So what we have done is we think we have built flexibility. We have addressed issues up front. We've even gone to the detailed design on this particular class of ship, and we have it at the most mature level as compared to, say, either the Virginia or the Seawolf class, which are not as at that higher level in detailed design. So when you take all those factors into effect, I think what you see is that we think we are in a good place when it comes to both the cost and scheduling and to deliver that ship, because there is no alternative. As you mentioned earlier, it's the most survivable leg of the triad, and we have to deliver that capability to the nation.
I agree, Admiral. Thank you for your answer. Secretary Stackley, because of the strategic mission of the SSBNX and the fact that it remains, as we've talked about today, the most viable leg of the nuclear triad, some, including the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ruffhead, have stated support for moving the SSBNX funding out of the Navy's shipbuilding and conversion account to alleviate fiscal pressures on their on other shipbuilding programs. Given the fiscal pressures across all of the U.S. Government, can you outline how that could be accomplished without decreasing the top line of the Navy's yearly budget?
I don't have good past examples of being able to do that, but we have a couple of examples of other major programs that have been set aside, if you will, into a special fund. So we established you all established the National Defense Sea Lift Fund back almost 20 years ago now to address the need to recapitalize our sea lift fleet, and that's proven very effective. More recently, Missile Defense Agency has been separately appropriated, again, to fund the investments required on the development side and some procurement to address what is, in fact, a national security priority. So those are probably the two closest recent examples of separately funding something, a requirement that's at that level of importance and frankly, that level, that size. Barring any other alternatives, we've brought the cost of the highway replacement to bear against the total shipbuilding top line. If it does nothing else, it brings the issue to light much earlier in the process so that the administration and the Congress have the opportunity to wrestle with how do we fit the recapitalization of the Ohio class within the other pressing priorities that the Department's facing.
Thank you, Secretary. Turning to Virginia class, if I could, Admiral Blake, to kind of the shop drop in our attack submarine force as legacy systems leave the fleet. The Navy is set to procure, as you know, 2 Virginia-class submarines per year until 2018. After that date, however, the force is going to begin to drop below the Navy's requirement for a 48-ship fleet. What are the possible mitigation strategies to counter this shortfall? And in particular, what effect would procuring an additional submarine in 2018 have in the Navy's attack submarine shortfall?
Well, sir, that's sort of a two-part. What have we done to this point? First of all, we've accelerated the delivery of the Virginia class. We have gotten that down from the 72 months down to 60 months. Second, we've looked at the Virginia class and not only the Virginia class, but all submarines, and determined which, if you will, could be best in breed, and we might be able to get extensions out of those boats. Specifically to the 2018 boat, one of the real challenges we have there is if we were going to be able to put that boat in there, we would then have to come up with both economic order quantity and advanced procurement in fiscal years 14, 15, 16, and 17 to the tune of about $950 million to $1 billion in dollars in those years. And then we would have to come up with the additional dollars in 18 to buy that. And what really complicates it is we have, as you know, within our top line, all the R&D and the initial dollars for bringing the SSB and X online. So when you couple that in there, that's where it comes. If we were to if that boat were to be there, would it mitigate our shortfall? Absolutely. But what you have to do is you have to look across the entire portfolio, not only with the attack submarines, but also with the surface units, because we have to balance within our portfolio. We have to be concerned about getting our amphib numbers there. We also have the issue coming between 2020 and 2030 when we have large numbers of surface combatants going away, and we have to replenish those stocks. So when you look at, if you just take it in isolation, anything is possible. But when you take it and look across the entire portfolio, that's where the real challenge comes for us.
Thank you, Admiral. Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back.
Thank you. And Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, General Admiral and Secretary, thanks for your service and your dedication in working with us and trying to get the Navy where we think they need to be at, and the Marine Corps as well. First question, I guess, would be for General Flynn, kind of going off Mr. Kaufman's and Mr. Kritz's comments on the LHAs 6 and 7. Do you think there's any commentary on the Marine Corps right now, the fact that they don't have well decks, the fact that they can't support any kind of landing craft going out of them, or do you think that kind of plays into the cancellation of the expeditionary fighting vehicle and looking for a new one there? Is there any commentary there that the Marine Corps now has LHAs with no well decks?
No, sir. I don't believe there's anything like that there. The decision to build the LHAs without the well decks was made probably, I think, about well over 5-6 years ago. And at the same time, the commitment, we were moving ahead with the expeditionary fighting vehicle. So I don't see any commentary there at all, sir.
Do you think it's wise to have LHAs with no well decks?
Sir, I believe when you have a limited number of dollars to spend on shipbuilding, the more versatility and flexibility you can get in the ship is what we should look for. And that is why over the last year we've been working with the Department of the Navy and the Navy to, when we build LHA 8 in 16, we're going to put the well deck back in, because that will give you the most flexibility and versatility out of a limited number of assets. So I'm a believer in a well deck, and when I testified last year, I said we should be looking about putting a well deck back in, and I think we're on the path to do that, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Stackley, you concur that LHA 8 is going to have a...
Yes, sir. We're basically doing an analysis of alternatives right now, looking at different approaches towards restoring the well deck to the LHA 8, considering, one, the time frame, and then two, what's the most affordable method to give that ship that capability.
Okay. Next question is kind of broad. If you look at world events and where we're based at, where the Fifth Fleet is, countries that we use for kind of bases of operations because we have to, and as we start pulling away from those places, let's say, if we start moving away from places like Bahrain because of their style of government, which we don't fully support, but we have to use them, and we do support them in certain ways. But as we move away from that, and as we move into more of a, let's call it sea-based basing, last week, I think it was Admiral Ruffhead said the great thing about a carrier or any other kind of ship is that you create your runway on the water there, right? So you're based out of the water, and you can go anywhere, and you don't have to use these bases, which we might not like the people that in those countries that they reside. So the question is this: one, moving this conversation from what I just stated to things like the MLP, to things like, hey, we have to sea base now. We're going to have to do it more. I frankly think we should start doing it now. Secretary Mavis didn't really have a great answer last week because he said, well, what we're doing now is based on the QDR. Well, the QDR didn't account for Libya, and doesn't account for Bahrain, it doesn't account for Egypt, it doesn't account for all of these things that just happened to blow up in the last month, right? This stuff all just happened. It accounts for 2 ongoing operations, but not in the way that it's happening now. So the question is, how much more important does it make things like having an MLP? And General Flynn, please, and Admiral, whoever would like to, this is my last question. So how much more important does world scenarios, kind of the way things are right now, play when it comes to total sea basing and things like the MLP and being able to transfer cargo and that thing in the ocean?
Yes, sir. I think if you look at the Navy Marine Corps team, we have always been expeditionary in our approach. So we like to say we only like to play away games. We don't like to play home games. And by that we mean we want to be out there forward deployed and providing a deterrence presence, if you will, as we're out there. When you look at what we were able to do, Admiral Vern Clark, when he was CNO, used to say, "Oh, we can go anywhere and we don't need a permission slip." And that's exactly where we want to be. And so, as you have articulated, this combination of amphibious and surface combatants and aviation is what gives us that ability to be forward deployed and give that forward presence to the country. And I think it's an absolutely critical aspect.
Sir, a key part of that is I think our approach to what we're doing with maritime prepositioning and working with the Navy and getting the MLP going, and also adding the TAKEs to the existing squadrons are an example, first of all, of frugality. We're taking existing assets and we're making them more useful for the environment that we're about to receive or about to see. So what you see by the addition of the MLP and what you see by the addition of the TAKE is we will have the ability, without going into port, to do selective offload of the MPS ships and also to be able to do at-sea transfer of vehicles so that you can get them to the connectors that you need to have relevance ashore. So I think first of all, I think it was a frugal approach, and the other part is I think it's going to tremendously increase our capability.
Thank you. Ms. Davis.
Thank you all for being here, and perhaps just put in a plug for some front loading of that funding from time to time when it looks like we could use it. I would certainly ask us all. I think we've been looking at that for some time. I wanted to ask about the reasoning behind carrier home porting decisions. I know that's a difficult one. I know it's complex. I know a lot of things go into that. but it's difficult to actually pin folks down about it, quite frankly. So I'm going to ask you if you could tell me, exactly what goes into the process of determining a home port and what can affect a change in those decisions, because sometimes we see that the Navy plans to home port ships in different locations or move ships, and yet then it's determined that new ships are coming online, so that's not a good idea to do that was previously thought would work. Tell me a little bit about more about that and what we can expect, and how sometimes the delays in shipbuilding negatively affect those home porting decisions as well.
I'm going to have Admiral Blake address the home porting issue, and then I'll talk about delays in shipbuilding.
Thank you.
I'll give you, if we take the West Coast for an example, if you look, we have three home ports on the West Coast that are carrier capable. We have the two up in the Northwest, and then we have the one down in San Diego. And if you look, we are positioned to put one carrier in Bremerton, one carrier in Everett, and then have up to 3 carriers in San Diego. And additionally, because carriers have to go into the yard, what we have is we have the ability to put a carrier up in Bremerton in order to give it an extended yard period with a dry docking. Most recent example is the Nimitz class, the Nimitz itself, actually. And what we have to, as we have to factor in, as we are, if you will, moving the ships around, is we like to have that strategic balance, and we like to make sure that we are filling all the holes, if you will, as we are moving the assets between locations. With respect to the Nimitz, it was the only yard we could use on the West Coast, so we pushed her up there, and then the decision was made to leave her up there. But if you look overall, the overall plan for the Navy in the long term would be that we would continue to use the Everett yard, the Bremerton, the Everett facilities, the Bremerton facilities, and then we would also have up to 3 carriers, in the San Diego area, and that is how we do it. So we move them around.
But we also know that there's some delays or questions whether a new carrier would be coming certainly to San Diego. I'm just trying to understand again whether, even though that may be the strategic desire to have 3 carriers there's a reality that we're sort of waiting to see what's really going to happen on that front. And it almost feels as if there are some different decisions for the West Coast and the East Coast, which are also strategic balance.
Well, I would say if you look at San Diego, we have 50 ships, 70,000 personnel in San Diego alone, and there is no effort. Not effort is the wrong term, but we are not going to walk away from San Diego, and I think it's just a matter of, as we move the assets around, and we have to, if you will, place them in the various locations. And as I mentioned earlier, San Diego will always be up to 3 carriers. Mm-hmm. Because it has the capability to do it.
In the few remaining, I think there's a minute left, I wanted to just ask a littoral combat LCS question as well, and whether there are any maintenance or docking space requirements that are unique to the aluminum hull LCS, and what are the cost and basing impacts to the Navy?
Currently, what we're doing right now is we're looking at both East and West Coast options for the home porting. The initial home ports are going to be San Diego on the West Coast and Mayfair on the East Coast. But I would tell you, as the inventory fills out, the end inventory is 55 ships. There is every reason to believe that we will expand that because you have to, because you only have a limited number of facilities within those 2 bases. So we'll have to do the environmental assessments, and then following that, we will then look at additional bases.
Mm-hmm. Okay, my time is up. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
And Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here today. There's no doubt there's a lot of concerns on all of Americans' minds, and they typically right now are centered around jobs, creating American jobs, the economy, our national debt, and they're all looking for solutions on how we're going to solve these issues. Really brings it home is when Chairman Mullins, or Admiral Mullins, actually says that the greatest threat to our national security is our national debt. Many of my colleagues are looking for ways to reduce our deficits and pay down our national debt. And I'm afraid that in the flurry of trying to find ways to reduce our deficit and our debt, they're going to be looking at our Department of Defense. And as most of our colleagues are also, we're 100% committed to making sure that our warfighters have the best equipment, best training, to the best value to the American taxpayer. So it kind of brings me to a question on Navy acquisition strategy. So my question is going to be for Secretary Stackley. Since coming to Congress, I've become aware of several recent examples of multi-year procurement contracts in Navy acquisition. And I'm also aware that Ingalls Shipbuilding in Pascagoula, which happens to be in my district, recently completed its sea trials for its 28th Arleigh Burke class destroyer, which was funded under a multi-year procurement contract that started in fiscal year 2002. I believe the DDG 51 restart is good for the Navy and good for the nation. I'm looking forward to these ships being built very soon. In today's tight budget environment, with increasing pressure on these budgets in the future, it's important for us to look at funding future ships like the DDG 51 restart in the most efficient way possible. I understand the multi-year procurements are generating savings for the taxpayer and promoting stability for the defense industrial base. Simply put, I believe we need to move toward more of these types of contracts. How can this committee assist you in enabling multi-year procurements for programs such as the DDG 51 Arleigh Burke class destroyer and other programs?
Well, let me start by saying that the Burke program has had 2 multi-years, both of which were very effective in terms of yielding savings for the department. And in establishing the strategy for the restart on the 51, through a series of discussions and decisions, we worked with industry to initiate the restart at Ingalls. So, in fact, the DDG 113, which is the first ship of the restart, is under negotiation right now with Ingalls. And when we look ahead towards getting past the restart and into stable production, in fact, we are targeting a multi-year procurement in 2013. So in our budget exhibits, when you look out over the fit-up, you'll see a plan for multi-year procurement. The plan is a 5-year multi-year, which includes 9 ships in those years. And a lot of effort went into our 2012 budget build to make room for a second ship in 2014, which is right in the middle of that potential multi-year window to give both the volume and the stability that the program needs in order to yield the savings. So right now we're at the point in the process where we're working inside of the department to address all of the issues that we need to certify before coming back to Congress, notionally 1 March 2012, with a legislative proposal for multi-year procurement on the 51s.
Okay, and you'll let this committee know if there's any way that we can assist in that acquisition strategy. Are there any other additional or specific authorities necessary for the Navy to continue pursuing this acquisition strategy, or is it?
No, sir. I mean, WSARA, 2009 WSARA pretty well laid out what we need to do to certify the multi-year, and we're attacking it up front. And frankly, since it's been so long since we executed a 51 multi-year, it'll be a 10-year period. We're having to re-engage portions of the department to get back up to speed on the 51 program in order to support that certification.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. You know, I definitely believe in a strong, robust Navy is key and critical to the future of our national defense as well as our global force projection. So thank you all for y'all's service, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. And now we're going to go to Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the panel, for being here today. I too understand how important it is to bulk up the backbone of our ability to provide security for the nation. And so I support this expansion. And history shows that a strong Navy is critical to a nation's defensive and offensive capabilities, as well as necessary for the protection of merchant vessels and key sea lanes of communication. And I think with respect to the Navy, it's better that we have and not need, as opposed to need and not have, given the amount of time it takes to build these ships. I do have some questions, however, regarding the shipbuilding program as it's been presented. I'm concerned that we may be prioritizing quantity at the expense of quality, particularly given our short-term focus on light ships designed for use in coastal waters. I'm concerned about unresolved questions regarding survivability of the LCS. I'm concerned by projected shortfalls of cruisers and destroyers, the backbone of our blue water surface combatant fleet, in out years of the long-term shipbuilding program. And I'm also concerned that projected cost of expensive programs like the DDG 1000 and Ohio-class submarine may be unrealistically low. Secretary Stackley, for years the Director of Operational Testing and Evaluation has raised serious concerns regarding survivability of the littoral combat ship and whether LCS meets its Level 1 survivability requirement. Why are LCS full ship shock tests not scheduled until fiscal year 14, when we will already have produced 10 or 12 ships? And why would we begin full-scale production of this ship if there are serious outstanding concerns regarding its survivability?
Yes, sir. Let me first by describing LCS 1 and 2 are both designed to level 1 level of survivability, and all of the analysis and testing to date supports the determination that they in fact meet their survivability requirements. The scheduling of the full ship shock trial on LCS in 2014 is about right compared to all other shipbuilding programs. In fact, typically in a major shipbuilding program, you don't shock the lead ship, you end up shocking one of the first follow ships. So for example, the last major shipbuilding program that we conducted shock trials on, DG-51, the first ship to be shocked was DG-53, which wasn't delivered until 2 years after the 51. And by the time she was shocked, we had about 20 DG-51s under contract and in full rate production. The nature of the beast in shipbuilding is that you have such a large capital-intense structure that's building these ships that you cannot afford to stop construction and wait for the lead ship to be built, tested, and then get around to the full ship shock before you start construction again. So what we do is we address to the extent possible through analysis and surrogate testing and developmental testing, proof out the design so that by the time we get to the shock trial, the risk has been retired. And in fact, if you go back and look at the results from prior full ship shock trials, the change activity that's driven into those ships' designs is relatively minimal because we have in fact spent so much time on the front end of the design to retire that risk. And we see the same case here for LCS.
Thank you. Admiral Blake, naval aviators will tell you that over the course of a deployment or a career, engine failures are common, and twin-engine aircraft can make the difference between ditching and saving the aircraft, and maybe the life of the pilot. What steps are you taking to mitigate the risk of single-engine carrier operations with the Joint Strike Fighter?
First of all, there has been extensive testing with respect to the engines, the engine for the Joint Strike Fighter, so that the reliability in a single-engine aircraft will be able to function and will provide a margin of safety to those pilots as they are airborne. So what we have done is we have taken the engine itself with the manufacturer and gone into a series of scenarios in order to ensure that our personnel are in fact safe when they're doing it. You are absolutely correct. A multi-engine aircraft is you have backup, but what we have essentially done is we've said, all right, we're going to look at this engine and we're going to. We have had single-engine aircraft in the Navy before. We in the early '60s we had aircraft such as the A-4, in which we and the Crusader, the F-8. So this is not new to us. We just have to deal with it from a reliability perspective and make sure that it meets its goals.
Our last questioner is going to be Mr. Bartlett, I believe, former chairman. The best
Thank you.
last.
And I apologize for being late, but we had a Army modernization hearing that I needed to chair, and I came here so soon as I could when that was over. In looking at the clips yesterday from the press, I noted a comment in one of the articles that wondered in this constrained environment, fiscal environment, would we continue to choose to spend money on things like the 20th century aircraft carrier, as they noted it. This reminded me of a question that I've had about technologies and which one will run faster. The carrier, for instance, will our ability to defend it, for it to be defended, run faster than the ability of an enemy to attack it? Witness the new Chinese anti-ship missile and the J-20, which some have suggested may be designed to deliver a wave-skimming supersonic cruise missile. Regina Dugan, the new head of DARPA, was in my office the other day, and I asked her if they could help with that kind of an analysis. I was concerned about the deep strike heavy bomber and whether our ability to be stealthy or the ability of the radars to pick it up and the air-to-ground defenses to take us out would run faster, and we wouldn't want to have the momentum of the past determining the future if that wasn't going to be very productive. She said, yes, they could do that kind of thing. In fact, they had done it, and they were looking at cyber warfare, and they noted that the lines of malcode that the bad guys used had not increased through the years. But the lines of code that we were using to defend ourselves were increasing exponentially. And if we cannot bend that curve, the day will come when about all our computer systems will be able to defend themselves. Now I'm wondering, who in the Navy looks at that kind of thing down the road, looks at these technologies and the rate at which they will be running, and this will illuminate our judgment in what we ought to be building, because it's pretty silly to build something now that technology in 20 years from now will be able to neutralize. Who does this and how do we do it?
Well, I'll start. Let me first describe that there are a couple pieces of this. First is threat assessment in terms of where is the threat and where are they going, and so there's a fairly robust number of organizations that are trying to project the threat. Second is technology. Where is technology? Where is it going? So that when we look towards planning, bringing capabilities to bear against that threat, that we can target where's the technology, where's the threat going to be. And then inside the Department of the Navy, you mentioned Regina Dugan from DARPA, a lead organization inside the Department of the Navy, the Office of Naval Research, is responsible for looking out ahead in terms of technology and projecting what are the opportunities in terms of where we can militarize technologies to address future threats. Separate from that is the requirements process, which I think Admiral Blake will describe.
Yes, sir. Well, as Mr. Stackley just mentioned to you, we have the Office of the Naval Research, which works in conjunction with DARPA, and then they provide us on the N8 side, which is the requirements and the integration piece, where we think we should be able to go, or look at R&D programs where we think we can address and, if you will, get inside a potential opponent's OODA loop. You mentioned earlier in the process, earlier in your remarks about, in general, anti-access. That is one of the areas we are particularly concentrating on, but not only in the scenario which you described, but worldwide, because there is a proliferation of systems not only in the Pacific, but worldwide that we have to deal with. And one of the biggest issues when we go into that is we have to ensure that we can't just look at it in isolation, if you will, in one particular area. We have to look across the entire spectrum, and we have to deal with it in the places we are likely going to have to go. So I would say, yes, you have organizations like DARPA. On our side of the equation, we have the Office of Naval Research, and then what they do is they provide us, we go into memorandums of understanding with them in order to be able to work on potential technologies in order to meet those requirements.
Thank you. Thank you much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I was cheating just a little bit. I had, I think, a couple of fairly quick questions. The first was, we had 10 carrier air wings. We've reduced them now to 9. Is there any plan, if we're reducing carrier air wings, does that suggest that we're not really fully committed to the 11 carrier strategy?
No, sir. I think there might be a little confusion on that point. When we put together the 2012 budget, we reduced 1 carrier air wing staff and 1 carrier strike group staff. We did not reduce the number of carrier air wings, and we did not reduce the number of carriers. So I think that's just a confusion point. And then what we do is, so we would still have available the 11 carriers and 10 air wings. But as an efficiency, we were able to take it down by 1, the staff.
Thank you for clarifying that. Other question was sort of a larger view. Our earlier panel talked about the CBO had been, and they're pretty good at estimating what things are going to cost, had been talking about the fact that they see that the budget we're looking at is between $1 billion to $3 billion per year. They feel a little bit too optimistic, and that maybe you're expecting every single thing to go right from a cost point of view. Do you think you've drawn it pretty close to the line, or maybe even a little over the line, or do you really have a good sense you can bring things in and not be over $1 to $3 billion per year?
Let me start by, I should first focus inside of the fit-up. And the reality is that the closer the programs that you're estimating are to real time, the closer your estimates will be. So we put a lot of attention onto the shipbuilding programs that are in hand to ensure that those are, the estimates on those programs are appropriate. And then the issue becomes one of execution. So I could go program by program inside of the fit-up and highlight where we feel very strongly in terms of our estimates. But similarly, there are areas where we've got some risk. One on execution side, and there's another area of risk associated with things that we forecast and then we have to wrestle with. For example, escalation. So I think Dr. Labs pointed out that a difference between CBO's estimates and the Navy's estimates, there's a difference in terms of how we account for escalation. Well, in the near term, that difference is de minimis. But then when you start to look over the long term, there's a compounding effect. So that ends up being a pretty significant driver in terms of the difference between CBO and Department of the Navy's estimates, simply how we account for escalation. And that's less a matter of real escalation inside of shipbuilding and more a matter of what happens to escalation indices as programs get passed back and forth between the Department, OMB, and Congress. When we look out in the long term, there are several risk areas that we have to address. We are working hard on stability. You know, if you have a lot of fluctuation in your program, you're going to drive cost into the unnecessary cost increases to the programs that we don't budget for and we try to avoid. And then with that comes, there's an aspect associated with volume or business base. So right now we have a shipbuilding industrial base that is oversized for the workload coming its way. And one of our efforts is to, as best as possible, broadcast to industry, here's our plan, and we're going to stay with our plan so that industry can make appropriate efforts to right-size itself so it can perform more efficiently within that workload. We also have to use every tool in the toolbox, and one that I think has been underutilized for some time now is competition. And that's not just competition at the shipbuilder level, that's also competition in the combat system side of the house, and then competition down throughout the vendor base, where it is possible. And then you always wrestle with the volume issue versus the competition issue, and so we look for the sweet spot. So we've put honest effort into, one, we've strengthened our cost estimating team. We put honest effort into estimating inside the fit-up where we're budgeting, and then also estimating long-term so we can wrestle with the issues that are before us in terms of force structure versus affordability versus top line. But there are risks, and have we gone too far in terms of allowing risk to persist inside of our shipbuilding plan? I would say not yet. The Department, frankly, is not satisfied with the trends of cost in the shipbuilding program, and so what we should not be doing is accommodating those trends of increasing costs. What we've got to do is wrestle them to ground and reverse those trends. And so it's not simply a matter of what do you forecast in the out years, it's also what do you do in Department of the Navy to wrestle those trends to the ground and reverse them. And that's going to be, there's going to be 1,000 battles ahead to get there from here. And so we start now.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate your being there to fight all those battles as well. Thank you to our witnesses. As you see, we have a pretty dedicated committee here to last this long, and so there's a lot of interest, and appreciate your help. Thank you.